the genealogies of Matthew, actually one genealogy, made some pretty slow progress because there's a lot of storytelling involved. And we got all the way down to Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth, Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the father of King David. That's first part of verse 6. Jesse, all right, so let's think about this. Okay, Obed's mother was Ruth, and then Obed had Jesse. So Jesse would have been Ruth's grandson, right? And then Jesse has David. Ruth, I guess I would say, not original, a Jew. She was not a Jew, married an outstanding Jewish man, and David, who became the second king of Israel, was her great grandchild. Well, David's story is it's quite long and involved, and it's full of victory and defeat. Now, rarely would you read the biography of a character as prominent as David in Israel's history and read both their strengths and their flaws. I just think that's one of the interesting things, and maybe one of the things that makes the Bible so authentic is that it doesn't just paint David as a hero going from victory to victory to victory. Militarily and in terms of battle, yes, the guy won. He was a winner, and he knew how to lead troops, and virtually everywhere he went, every assignment he was given as a young man in Saul's army, he brought home victory. And his heart, well, he had the heart of an artist. And I know it's not a good thing to be using stereotypes like this. I don't like being stereotyped. I'm sure you don't. And it seems unfair to stereotype David as one of those guys, but he really was. He was a poet. He was a singer. He was a musician. And of quality enough that King Saul hired him on as a musician. That relationship didn't work out very well because I'm so tempted to tell you that a concise, long version of a concise story of David's life, but it wouldn't even be possible in the 9 minutes, 10 minutes I've got left here. So, but I will say, his story begins in the fields. He has older brothers, and they've all gone to war. They've all either volunteered or been conscripted into Saul's army against the Philistines. David's in the fields watching sheep. His dad says, go check on your brothers and take them some good cheese. Okay, that's the way it was done back then. Your family took care of you when you were in the army. So much about ancient history and ancient warfare it simply doesn't connect with our modern sensibilities about armies and fighting and the whole thing. But anyway, okay, David goes, and while he's there, pretty much on the front lines, which bear in mind, the front lines would have been not awfully dangerous until you got past the front line into the war zone, the battle zone, right? Uh, how far could a guy shoot an arrow off a bow? That was, if you were out of that range, you were safe. So David went, connected with his brothers, and while he was there, he heard the Philistines' hero, Goliath, a huge man. He would have made an NBA center look normal. He was huge. And not just in height, in every way. And he was quite alarming, because when he stepped out into that, zone, he began boasting and slinging out insults at Israel's army, and to the degree that he said, "Send me a man. We'll go mano a mano. If I win, you are ours. If you win," which, by the way, odds makers here in Vegas would have given that that Goliath would win would have been about a 700 to 1 odds, right? Well, maybe 1,500 to 1. There were virtually no reasonable odds in favor of David or anybody else in Israel. David was highly offended by this. And he told his brothers, somebody should get out there and do something. And essentially what they said was, "David, don't be stupid. This guy will kill anybody who comes up against him." And David says, I'm not going to let the name of the Lord be sullied in this way. So he goes to Saul and says, "I'll take him on." Saul says, "Son, you don't want to do that." David says, "Sure I do. I'll get him. I'll take him." Saul puts his armor on David. And Saul was a big man. Back a few chapters, when Saul was identified as the one to be the first king of Israel, he stood head and shoulders above everybody else. He was a big, big guy. Well, David was somewhere between his mid-teens to his early 20s. I mean, in that, he was just an adolescent, right? Not finished growing. Well, Saul's armor and equipment swallowed him, and he said, I can't use these. So he goes out to the little flowing creek and takes 5 smooth stones, puts them in his shepherd's pouch, takes out his shepherd's sling, meets Goliath, and Goliath just roars with laughter and says something to the effect of, "Am I a dog? How can you treat me this way? You're sending a boy? No, that won't." Next thing he knows, David is running toward him, spinning that slingshot, and he lets it go, and the stone hits Goliath between the eyes. He goes down, not dead, but knocked out. David climbs to him, pulls Goliath's own sword, cuts his head off, and the victory is Israel's. And David becomes mythically a hero. Interesting way to start when you think of it. The rest of David's military career was equally as amazing and positive and full of victory. In the meantime, his moral life, well, I can't be too hard on David. He began so devoted to God. And in some ways, he maintained his devotion to God, only compartmentalizing it, so that his spiritual devotion and his emotional and physical habits didn't have to connect. In my opinion, that's what it, well, when kings go out to war, one spring, David said, "No, you guys go without me." Stayed home. He was in his palace, which was probably easily the most substantial building, dwelling building in Jerusalem. He's on the top because it's warm, it's hot. He's up there catching the breeze, and he looks over and he sees a naked woman bathing on her rooftop. I've often heard this preached about, and the thing is, if you're a man, how do you not notice that, right? And then secondly, how do you not take a second look? Well, the second look, I think, is what got David. He sends one of his servants. They get her. Her name is Bathsheba. She comes to the palace. I do not believe she was raped by David, but how could she say no to the king? And in that one sexual encounter, she becomes pregnant. Oh, here's the problem. She's married, and her husband is on the front lines of the war that David didn't go to. When it becomes obvious, weeks later, that Bathsheba is pregnant, she's missed her period, she contacts him and says, "I'm pregnant." And he tries to figure a plan, and here's what he decides. I'll bring her husband home, I'll get him liquored up, and I'll send him back home. He'll have sex with her, and he'll not know the baby is not his. So he does that. But Uriah was his name, and he was too good of a man, too loyal of a soldier and servant. He doesn't go home. He sleeps in a walkway and says, "How can I go home to my bed and wife when my brothers are on the field?" Well, anyway, David does everything he can to get Uriah to go home, sleep with his wife. Uriah won't. And David realizes this, I can't fix it this way. So he writes a note to commanding officer and says, "Put Uriah out front and then drop back so that he will be killed." And that's what happens. This is murder by proxy, and was probably the darkest of David's life, the darkest thing he ever did. I'm out of time, so I'm going to close, and I'll pick David's story back up next time on So Care with Stevie Boy.